Wanted to call this hearing for the Pennsylvania Basic Ed Funding Commission to order as charged under Act 51 of 2014. I wanted to thank East Stroudsburg School District and the Pocono Region community for accommodating us today in our efforts to accomplish the charge of the commission, and that is to recommend to the General Assembly a new formula, a new means on which to distribute basic education funding to the 501 school districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This is our 8th hearing that we've conducted since starting our work in September. We've had an opportunity to collaborate and to hear community, expert, various testimony from many parties, stakeholders in the provision of education for our students in Pennsylvania from communities around the Commonwealth with many different characteristics, from the rural sections of northwestern Pennsylvania, from the suburban communities in the southeast, to urban communities, including our largest urban community in Philadelphia. And one thing that makes me confident about our abilities to accomplish, which I believe is in my 20 years in serving in the General Assembly, a very difficult task, is the fact there are many common elements, notwithstanding the diversity of communities in challenges that they face when it comes to investing resources on behalf of their students. I do know, having represented the Pocono region, that there are unique elements and circumstances in the Pocono region that need to be considered in any formula we recommend, and I look forward to discussing and hearing those during our hearing today. That being said, I'd like to have give an opportunity for the members and their designees and our host to introduce themselves or to provide any commentary, starting from my left.
Good morning. My name is Rita Perez. I am the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Curriculum, Assessment, and Instruction, and I'm here representing Acting Secretary Dumas today.
Good morning. Lloyd, Smucker, State Senator. I represent the 13th District, which is based in Lancaster County.
Good morning. Chris Wakeley, Executive Director of the House Education, for Representative Jim Roebuck, representing him as his designee to the Commission.
Senator Rob Teplitz, 15th District, Dauphin, and Perry counties.
Good morning. Representative Bernie O'Neill from the 29th District, which is in the center of Bucks County.
Representative Donna Oberlander. I represent the 63rd District, which is all of Clarion and parts of Armstrong and Forest counties.
Mike Hillman. I'm here on behalf of Representative Mark Longetti from Mercer County.
I'm Senator Pat Browne, representing the 16th Senate District in Lehigh County. One thing you'll note is that our commission, in what we represent and who we represent, also represents the broad diversity of the Commonwealth. I wanted to take an opportunity to also recognize our host, Representative Rosemary Brown, who's with us, for accommodating us and working with us towards our final goals and solutions. That being said, I would like to get the hearing started. I also like to, there's two other things I'd like to mention. Also, our co-chair, Representative Verb, will be with us shortly. And we do have a public comment period at the end of our hearing. Anyone who is interested in providing 2 minutes of testimony during the public comment period, we have a sign-up sheet. My associate, Vicki Wilkin, on the left has a sign-up sheet. We're going to be limiting this to the first 15 members of the public who come forward to provide some public testimony. So anyone who's interested, please come forward and provide your information on the sheet. That being said, I'd like to open it up to our first testifier, who's Nate Benefield, who's Vice President of Policy Analysis of the Commonwealth Foundation. Nate, thank you. And then if you're able to keep your official testimony to 15 to 20 minutes, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, and good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to testify here today. This is obviously one of the most important issues facing our state, and we appreciate the ability to come and speak to this. I'm joined today by James Paul, who is a senior senior policy analyst with the Commonwealth Foundation, and has done a lot of the research on this, and will help answer some of the questions you may have at the end on this. But this issue of education funding is one that I think is one of the most critical issues facing our state. It's a major issue for Commonwealth Foundation. We've certainly been looking at numbers and the trends across the state for a number of years, and want to bring you some of our perspective. All right, better? All right. It's clear that it's going to be very difficult to move to find a funding formula that makes sense and is fair and really makes all of the stakeholders happy. We know this is a big challenge, but I also think it's very clear, and I think everyone has heard this from previous hearings, that there's a large, broad consensus that the current funding system is broken. And I think this is agreed upon whether you're on the left or on the right, Republican, Democrats, even regions across the state. I think there's agreement that we need to do something differently than the funding formula or the funding model. It's not really a formula, but the funding model we've had in place for a number of years and need to address reform. And the problem is not simply that we're not spending enough money, or there's not enough revenue available. In fact, Pennsylvania's revenue per student, as we point out in the written testimony, is higher than the national average. Even looking at the state share, while the percentage that comes from the state is lower than the national average, the amount per student is right about the national average. And despite some of the myths, there has never been as high as 50%. That, in fact, where our revenues at the state level is comparable on a per student basis to the rest of the nation. But where there is a big problem is how those funds are allocated. And the way we've been funding schools for a number of years is unfair, is inequitable, and is certainly not very transparent in how that is done. What we believe we need to move to, I know other testifiers have agreed with this, is moving to a model that funds student needs and is based on student enrollment. Something that called a weighted student funding formula should replace the current model. And basically what weighted student funding, it's grounded in equity and in transparency. And it works basically that every provides funding to schools based on a baseline. Every student gets approximately the same amount of money per student from a baseline, with supplements for different types of students and student needs. This can be low-income students, a supplement for low-income students, a supplement for English language learners, and other supplements based on student needs, student enrollment, and the money follows the child to the school. This recognizes the fact that students are different and have different student needs. A number of states, as well as a number of large school districts, have in fact experimented with or implemented weighted student funding in some form. And there are different models. There's no perfect model of this. This is a model a lot of places have moved to or are looking to move to better fund and more equitably fund public schools. And while I know the commission here is really charged with looking at how we develop it for the state level and develop how we a formula for the basic education funding line item, ideally weighted student funding should exist at the district level as well, so that districts are giving money to schools based on student needs and enrollment, and giving local principals the greater flexibility in how to use those funds, and ensuring there's equity between buildings and between student populations. Now, this model is a sharp contrast with the current system, which is, includes hold harmless, which means that every school district gets the same amount of funding they got from the state the previous year. And while there's a lot of public support for keeping hold harmless, we believe that has, in fact, over the course of several decades of having hold harmless, has in fact created real harm to districts. It is one of the major drivers of funding inequity between schools, that growing schools have not seen their funding increase commensurate with their student growth, and declining schools have certainly kept retained funding that becomes, in some cases, very excessive in terms of their needs and the needs of their students. Meeting the needs of students really should be our top priority in how we fund education, not the last priority. To demonstrate, and to show how weighted student funding has had, or how hold harmless has, in fact, created this disparity, in 2012-13, 25 school districts in the state received more than $10,000 in state funding per student. On the other end of the spectrum, more than 50 school districts received less than $3,000 per student. And this disparity is not driven by student needs or district wealth, but by how we funded schools 30 years ago, and have kept that hold harmless in place and based it on previous enrollment and previous funding levels. Even more dramatically, when you look at growing districts and shrinking districts, and you can see there's a chart in the testimony that shows this, the 20 fastest growing school districts since 1986 get on average about $3,000 per student. The 20 students that have the greatest declines in enrollment get on average $9,900 per student. That's meaning shrinking districts are getting 3 times as much revenue per student. And again, those differences are not based on student poverty. It's not based on district wealth. It is primarily based on simply the enrollment trends that and keeping that funding level in place over 20 plus years. So transitioning away from hold harmless in favor of weighted student funding would be a fairer and more rational way to fund students and ensure equity and transparency in how we fund our education system. And then our written testimony, I'll quickly summarize what, we highlight 3 states that have gone to a student funding formula, and we outline those in the testimony. I think these are probably 3 of the best examples of states that have done the right thing. Hawaii has a statewide funding system with weights as a baseline level for all students, with an additional weights for English proficiency, for economically disadvantaged students, for transient students, as well as gifted and talented students. And they have a committee on weights that comes together and basically determines what those weights should be every year. In Rhode Island, this is one of a newer formula that's being implemented now, recently enacted. They have 3 components, which is a basic funding amount for all students, a supplement for economically disadvantaged students. This is really the only weight they have is for low-income students, and then they adjust that based on a computation for state versus local effort, and based it on the district needs and district ability to pay their share. And then in Florida, they have weights provided for different grade levels for special education students, as well as English language learners in Florida. And while the Florida model is based on weighted student funding principles and starts with that as the main mechanism for distributing funds to local schools, it does have we would say an excessive amount of supplements to that, and unnecessary additional supplements that really create more complexity and more confusion, and then enables political manipulation, which undermines the basic model of weighted student funding. And but those are 3 of the models, and I know that there's no perfect model of how those weights should be, and they're different in different states and different school districts that have weighted student funding models. But our recommendation is certainly to move away from the hold harmless model and to a weighted student funding model, recognizing that there will probably need to be some transition time and time period to make that adjustment from moving to the present system to a student funding model. But that is the model that will provide greater transparency, greater equity, and certainly a better funding model. We're talking about a model that will last decades, which is really the issue facing this commission and the challenge facing us today. So that concludes kind of my remarks, and I look forward to questions and discussion, and answer any questions you might have about it.
Thank you, Nate. Questions or comments from members? Yes, Representative Senator Teplitz.
Can I volunteer to explore the Hawaiian model firsthand? Just a question, or really a clarification. You talked about weights, but also supplements. Can you, are you using those terms interchangeably? And if not, can you distinguish between those two and what that means?
Yeah, I probably used them incorrect. I probably used supplements in two different ways in what I decided. The weights, as Hawaii has weights, are weights for different types of students. So there is a basic weight for every student based on grade level. Then they have additional weights for middle school students, K-12, English language learners, economically disadvantaged. So if you have, that economically disadvantaged student will get an additional amount of funding above what a non-poor student would get. So those are what we consider weights. I've mentioned supplements in other ways in Florida, which are kind of, all right, we have the basic weighted funding model, but in addition to that, we're going to give $3 million to schools of this type. So those are some of the supplements that, in addition to the weighted student funding model that we would frown upon, but in Hawaii and in other states they have a, you could call them supplements, but they're weights for different types of students.
In Florida, the supplements, which are, as Nate said, are different than weights. There are supplements for transportation, reading instruction, juvenile justice, declining enrollment, so a number of additional factors that, ideally that money would be handled all in one place. And as Nate mentioned on the weights, essentially what the weights do is it's a way to almost make it seem as though there are more of a certain type of student. So if you weight, for example, students that are identified as non-English proficient, by weighting them a certain way, it's only if you have, let's say there are 20 students who are non-English proficient, depending upon how you weight them, there would essentially be 30 students now, and then you multiply that 30 students by the baseline amount, and you'd end up with more funding for those students.
Is your position that having supplements undercuts going to a formula based on weights?
Yeah, it is that having supplements, especially supplements that are targeted for specific school districts or buildings or are tied to programs, it undermines the weighted student funding model and certainly the long-term funding process. And I think that's what we've seen in states that have added additional supplements over years and kept some of those in place. That it does undermine the model of distributing funds equitably to where students' needs are.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Smucker.
Thank you. Thank you, Nate, for your testimony. I think you presented information in ways that we hadn't seen specifically before, and so I think it would be very helpful. The Hawaii model, and I'm glad you brought other states that you think are working well. I think one of the opportunities we have is to try to identify models in other states, look at best practices and learn from them and possibly apply them here. And that's really the first I had seen the Hawaii model, and so I think that's one worth looking at. The idea of a committee that looks at the weights every year may be a good one. We learn, I think, and I don't want to speak for the committee, but we've had a lot of discussion about student-based funding weighted on specific factors, and I think testifiers all across the state and the committee realizes that we need to get to something along that line. But then when you ask specific questions about what those weights, or what the factors should be and how they should be weighted, it's very difficult to find even recommendations, because it's difficult to find the actual numbers of what works. And so I think at the end it's sort of an art more than a science. It's going to be hard to pin down exactly what those weights should be and what we recommend to the legislature. So the idea of a committee on weights might be an interesting one, where that ends up being sort of a dynamic model that is updated on an ongoing basis, rather than a decision that's made by the legislature at one point and it holds that way for an indefinite amount of time. So that's an interesting I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this. One of the questions I think we're going to need to answer as a commission in regards to the weights is whether the weighting is based on an individual student or whether we use statistics that are available district-wide. So for instance, poverty. And I understand the concept and agree with you that, you know, to the extent possible, we want the funding to be based on a student's needs. And so, you know, clearly, a formula that moves to student population. So you could start with a number, whether that's recommended by the commission or you extrapolate that from the total dollars available, that still would need to be decided. But you start with a number per student, and then the factors could potentially be based on district-wide information. For instance, the number of, Indiana does it this way, the number of households in a district as a percentage of total households that lives in poverty or extreme poverty. There are a number of different measures. And you then take that percentage times the factor, as opposed to trying to identify each student. And it may sound like there's not a lot of difference, but there really is. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Is it practical, first of all, to establish those factors on each student, or will it be necessary or advantageous, maybe even, to look at district-wide factors or district-wide statistics that are available?
Well, I mean, I think two things we're kind of talking about is one is, you know, should it be tied to students? And I think when you're looking at the funding, it is tied to district-wide enrollment, and you can do the factors. For instance, we know the number of low-income students based on, in every school district, based on the free and reduced lunch eligible. We know the number of English language learners that are tracked, and so you certainly can, and we would recommend having factors and weights for those student populations and based on each student. I think you're also talking, though, about adjustments based on district wealth or ability to pay, to kind of adjust those factors, and that I think, you know, other states have.
Well, and I think that we will need to do. I mean, that's a whole different component of the formula. Local tax effort that'll need to be factored in. But I'm talking specifically. My question to you is around the weights based on need.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that we have the information. We have the enrollment information on all these categories of students. So we can and should, I would say, have those factors and weights identified and set for each student. It's not it is, you know, for each student, and yet it's based on the district, you know, enrollment in those categories of students. So I think that is the best way to establish that. With I recognize there will be some adjustments based on district need and ability to pay.
One of the other interesting things about Hawaii is we've had discussion about transiency and how the fact that, you know, students moving in and out of a district or even in and out of a school within a district can really impact scores and impact the need for additional remediation. And Hawaii apparently, as you had mentioned, has some factor based on transiency. So that's one of the things I'll be interested in learning more about as well. So, thank you.
Thanks. Representative Oberlander.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to follow up on the weighted issue and kind of have a two-part question. First of all, in most of these hearings, we've heard from the school districts that predictability and stability is a real issue. Regardless of what we're giving, knowing what they're going to get and when they're going to get it is important. So I see with the Hawaii model, it seems like it changes yearly. Do you have any concerns, or have you done any more research on the predictability and the stability of that funding?
Not specifically in Hawaii. I know that, I mean, one of the issues is going to be, you know, if you make this change, I mean, the year-to-year change is not going to be that dramatic. It is the initial shift. And I think, James, you want to talk about Rhode Island has done this more recently and had a phase-in of that.
Right. I mean, especially if you're you're transitioning away from hold harmless, there's going to have to be a phase-in approach, and the Rhode Island model, which was recently enacted, is in the midst of, I believe, a 7-year transition. So that the details of that would have to be worked out by the legislature, and that could be done. In terms of specific student enrollment year over year, I know this is true in Florida, Rhode Island, and in Hawaii. They use multiple counts throughout the early part of the school year to try to project enrollment for the next year, and I don't think there's an issue in terms of being able to project what enrollment will be into the next school year in terms of the stability of a weighted model.
Okay. Thank you. Your comments regarding Rhode Island are a perfect segue to the second part of my question. When you talk about the weights, and we've talked about a lot of different weights, poverty, scarcity, density, English learning, I noticed that Rhode Island does not include weights for English language learners, students in vocational schools, or gifted and talented students. And I have to think that there might be some merit, well, I do believe there's a merit in weighting those. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I'm not entirely familiar with the deliberations that resulted in Rhode Island's final decision on which characteristics to weight. It could have been political realities could have influenced that, so I'm not exactly sure about the specifics of why Rhode Island chose to implement the way they did, but there would be no reason why this legislature couldn't take a fresh look at that and decide what are the unique student characteristics that we want to weight, and how much are we going to weight them, and what will this mean in terms of actually funding students instead of funding buildings or funding districts.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Verb.
Thank you. I just want to introduce real quick from the 115 District Representative Dave Parker, and from the 176 Representative Jack Rader are here with us today. We thank them for being here. I do have a couple questions. In several hearings, we talk about a number of these factors: poverty, disabilities, just a number of factors. In any of these models, I mean, do we have any factor for higher performing schools, or the talented students or higher performing students? And if we have them, what are they? And I kind of go back to some of the districts down my way, where they're in a top performing list, but they also are the least supported by the state in that particular region. So is there any kind of weight and option for that we've seen in other models that actually recognize those higher performing students in schools?
So Hawaii does have a gifted and talented weight. The other 3 states, I do not believe, have any specific kind of incentive-like weight for high-performing schools. It's certainly something that could be implemented. That I would again underscore that ideally it would be you'd want to weight students, not schools, and there's some distinction there, not a huge one, but some. So there could be a system where you would weight, provide a set of funding that would be available for students who either are high performing or see improvement from one year to the next, or over a certain period of time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've, like I said, in the initial comments I've made, we have heard consistently around the state an emphasis on a formula that would adjust for student need, and that's been encouraging, because you're having common opinions in a very diverse state and different communities of how to do this is something that makes our role more defendable, I guess, in terms of moving in that direction. The issue that's come up several times and is actually within the formulas that you're recommending in other states is also the consideration of a foundation amount Florida presented that to us. It's in Rhode Island, and it's also in Hawaii. Could you comment on that component of their formulas?
So, you know, as the name foundation suggests, it really is the baseline starting point, and it's an essential part of a weighted model, right? So, you know, I would say that even before weighted student funding addresses individual student needs, the first thing it does is actually address students, number of students, which is an essential part of a good formula. So before you even begin to adjust for additional characteristics or unique student characteristics to be determined by need, you need to have a handle on how many students there are, and there should be a baseline amount for each student, and that's what a baseline funding level or a foundational amount would do. It would kind of start at an even place where every student in the Commonwealth would receive at least a certain amount of state funding, and from there, then you would move into the additional weights based on unique characteristics.
You have it, and has been many ways, many variations that have been used in many, many states of how that a state would come about doing that. And because of the variations of ways to do it, it tends to be pretty controversial. Do you, in regards to the Commonwealth Foundation and that component of the conversation, do you have any recommendations of how this commission would look at that and how it would be determined?
I do think that having I mean, as Senator Smucker mentioned, having a committee that is permanently in place to look at those numbers every year and adjust them based on, as every state has kind of done their own different thing. There's no perfect model out there, and they've even, they have their own numbers they've come to, their own weights they've come to, but to be able to look at that and see after a year, 2 years, what is working, what is not. And I know there was other testifiers who talked about, you could look at this after a year and say, well, low-income students in the state are not doing well. Perhaps we need to adjust that weight, and that weight is too low or too high. To be able to have that ability to come back and look at that through an independent commission, I think, would be the best way to be able to come to those numbers, come to consensus, and set the baseline, foundation level, and weights every year or 2 years.
We had the Florida, I guess, former Secretary of Education from Florida testified to us in Harrisburg and present their approach. One thing I noted about their approach is it has, it tends to be more comprehensive than other ones in the fact that it has a lot of adjustments, a lot of additional components dictated in state law and state formula to accommodate different, very different interests. Other than just a formula with weighted students and then weighting districts based on district characteristics. One of the comments I've heard in that regard is that and some of it has to do with the homogeneity of Florida in terms of the number of districts they have. A lot less than we have. I think they have 60 districts and are a lot bigger than ours. That because of the number of districts they have, they're a lot more homogeneous, and you can accommodate various interests that way. But the other comment I heard is that it provides a lot more state direction in terms of what districts should be spending on and how they should be spending it than we currently have and what I've seen in most states. Now, if from your perspective, in regards to what the formula presents from a policy perspective in determining how state money should be spent by categorizing it in many, many different ways, is that something that you see some value in or something we should stay away from?
Well, I mean, I would recommend shying away from that to going too far. I think it can certainly go too far in terms of what the state mandates and requires and sets aside funding for. Part of it is it restricts school districts' ability to experiment and do different things. I think we've talked about kind of the I think I'm borrowing a phrase that I might butcher, but a tighty-loosey or strong-loosey. We want to have strong standards at the state level, strong expectations of what what schools we expect schools to perform at, have strong accountability measures, have transparency measures, but then allow much greater flexibility at the local level of how the dollars are spent to achieve those goals and provide those results and track how those dollars are spent. And that, allows us to see what works. And you can look at school districts that are performing very well and where those dollars go that are working, and then can use that to, it can encourage and incentivize other schools to follow that model without necessarily mandating that. My other concern with having too many additional supplements or specific programmatic funding is that there's a lot of politics that go into that, and that I know that obviously I'm talking to lawmakers, so it's very probably to keep things legislatively, but I think what we've seen over the last 20 years in Pennsylvania is a lot of the additional funding that we've gone on top of hold harmless has been driven by politics. And I want to set up something to give money to my district, bring money home, which works well in a year or 2 years, but over 20, 30 years, it really distorts where dollars are driven out and how we create inequities in our funding system.
Now, I'm assuming based on the models that you're presenting to us as far as benchmarking, that you would agree with the factors that they are using? That these are factors that if were considered by this commission, they would be factors that you would support?
Generally, but as you'll notice, there is some diversity within even the 3 states that we present. Is that, like, for example, Rhode Island only weights one factor.
But understanding that, you're presenting models of other states. If we benchmarked against these and included all of these factors in our model, that these factors would be something that if we included, you would be supportive of.
Yes, that's fair to say. I mean, even at a broader level, I would say that what we would support is that a high percentage of total education funding from the state level would be contained within the basic education line item, and then within that line item there would be weights, and there would be weights that were solely for the most necessary unique student characteristics, and that would be it. We would then shy away from the additional supplements which are not student-based, which are not based on individual student need.
So, simply that, for your question, I don't see any of the weights or factors in any of these states that we would find objectionable or wrong or misguided.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Chris Wheatley for
Yes.
Chairman Roebuck.
What is the cost of hold harmless a year? We always hear about this is a problem. So what's the actual cost in terms of to the state, in terms of how much more does it cost us to do that?
I mean, I don't really know how you would get at that question of what the cost is. The impact, obviously seen over many years, is that you have districts that are getting significantly more per student than districts that are growing. I don't really know how to put a number or calculate what that cost
Well, I guess
would be.
I guess my question is, couldn't you just total up how much a school district should be getting under the normal formula, and if you deduct off how much more they're getting beyond the formula, in the same way those who are getting less? I do think I think it's important that we come up with that figure, because I think it's, you need to put into perspective, I think to some degree, hold harmless as to all the other issues here. Because this commission isn't just about hold harmless. There's a lot of issues regarding basic ed funding. So I think it's important for us to, I don't know if the department can provide us with that information, or the appropriation staffs here can provide us with that information. I think that would be extremely useful for the commission. Second question, looking at your model, you talk about a base amount, the earlier question by Senator Browne, that would be probably decided by a commission or some method. My question is then that baseline funding, no matter what that number is, does that go to every school district, irregardless of its tax effort or its local wealth?
Well, I mean, what they've done, so for instance, the baseline weight, I'm looking at Hawaii right now, is, $34.93 per student, with additional weights on top of that. But then you can have adjustments to that amount based on district wealth, district poverty levels. And I think Rhode Island has, one of their, it's not really a factor, they have a factor just for low-income students, but then they adjust that based on what the local tax base is and the local income level is to adjust that based on district need and ability to pay at the district level versus the state.
Okay, so it's not just a flat, okay, this is how much we think should be the base, basically foundation funding, if you call it baseline funding. Every school gets that, no matter what their tax effort, or, you're not talking for that, you're talking about taking into
Yeah, I mean,
effect
one
wealth and tax effort.
Yeah, I think you can adjust it for wealth. Another way to address it is if you have a substantial weight on low-income students, you're also helping to address the inequity that way by having a significant weight to for student. A lot of schools that have a high poverty concentration will get significantly more funding per student because of that.
I mean, I think the concern is if you don't have some sort of, adjustment for tax effort or wealth, what you're going to end up with is every school district, particularly the richer school districts, they're going to see their state funds go up pretty substantially, and that's going to be an added cost to the state on top of whatever cost it's going to be to address perhaps disparities in the system. So I just would caution when we talk about baseline funding that, that has to take into account to some degree wealth and tax effort. Thank you.
And on the comment of hold harmless in relation to what it would be if you, I've run this model before, if you took current state support and put it through a current student count aid ratio analysis, it results in massive shifts from some districts to others, and that's that is the effect of hold harmless. Is if you do it that way, you do have significant financial results. So, conversation about how to deal with that when it comes to adjusting for that is over time is important.
But even if I would just point out, even if you're talking about, slowly but surely phasing out hold harmless, while you're in essence eliminating in terms of the formula the hold harmless, if politically you decide for whatever reason you need to, slowly take it down, there's going to be a cost to that. There's going to be a cost over time. Those school districts aren't going to lose all of that money all at once. So there's an additional cost to the system. So I'm trying to get at that figure of what would it cost if, in fact, what is the cost of basically overpaying the districts that are losing population? What's the cost of that? And thus, how do we, if we decide to either eliminate it or phase it out, what's the cost of doing that over time? And factoring that into whatever it is that we're going to come out with the formula.
Thank you. Senator Smucker.
I'd like to take that discussion just one step further and get your thoughts, your comments. We know if we're going to move to a different formula and move away from the hold harmless as currently exists, we'll be doing that over time. And I don't know how much time. I don't even know whether we can do it, but it's not something that we decide next year. We're going to completely base funding on a foundation model with weights and factors. That it's going to have to be phased in over time. So my question is beyond that. The sort of the core argument around hold harmless, and you could extend this argument to losing students for any reason, whether students are leaving your district because they're moving out of the area, or whether they're going to charter schools, for instance. It's a similar kind of parallel discussion, and that is, the schools that are losing population will argue, and have successfully argued, it's how we got hold harmless, that even though we've lost students, it's difficult for us to eliminate the costs that we have in place. You may lose a handful of students from a number of different classrooms, so you are not able to adjust your teacher count quickly, or you're not able to, in extreme, close a building, as some school districts have had to do when they've lost students. So that takes time. So my question to you is this. If we move to a different system, we will still have fluctuations in population, and you will still have students or districts losing students, and for multiple reasons. But I think the impact on the district is the same, regardless of whether they're leaving for charter schools, regardless of whether they're leaving just because they're moving out of the area. The impact's the same. And I maybe there's a middle ground, and this is what I want to get your comments on. I think you have to agree that it may be difficult for a district to reduce costs immediately in the next school year. It may be difficult to do that over a few years. But I think also the other end of the argument, it's not sustainable to expect that they can't reduce costs over 20 years. And in fact, if we don't, it completely, you don't end up with a formula anymore, which is where we are today. So my question is, would it make sense in the future if a student or if a district is losing students to recognize that we have a student-based formula, so recognize that their funding will drop, but also recognize that it may be difficult for them to reduce those expenditures in the next year or the next 2 years. And so you phase in that reduction in cost. I don't know whether that makes sense or not. So what I'm talking about specifically, if you have a district, just throw some numbers in the air of 10,000 students, say, and they lose 1,000 students in a particular year. I'm making it up completely. I don't know whether that would ever happen. But could you say over the next 3 years, for instance, we're going to reduce that funding per student by those 1,000 students, but it's going to be phased in over 3 years rather than being a direct correlation immediately to the number of students?
Well, I would say, that's not completely unreasonable to have a phase-in of the reduction, but I would urge caution because it does tend to, sustain the hold harmless, which has caused problems. And I actually prepared an example, of the question, using Lancaster School District, but in between 2011 and 12, Lancaster gained 222 students, and their state funding went up by 4.2 million, which is about 3.5% per student. That's a little bit higher than the state average per student. So we did the model basically saying, what if Lancaster had lost one student? 'Cause that's the example here. What if a school loses one student, they can't really cut funding? And if we had a weighted student funding model in place where the increase had basically been the same for every school, and Lancaster's per pupil funding had gone up by just 3%, they would have gotten an increase of 2.3 million. Now, while I'm sure the district would prefer the 4.2 million increase that they did get, I think what we're talking is not necessarily that they're getting a cut in funding, but they're dealing with a smaller increase, and we'll have to be able to make those adjustments. And we recognize that for districts that are having shrinking enrollment, and you can look at some of these across the state that have had significant declines over time, that there's going to be a real pain. I mean, they're going to have to make adjustments. They're going to have to be, you've seen building closures, you've seen layoffs when enrollment declines. You need to have layoffs in staff. And while I know we don't really necessarily want to see that, I think we believe that is the pain that is there is the lesser of two evils, that having a system of hold harmless where you've created distortions over 20 years and you have districts that are growing rapidly and cannot hire additional staff to keep up with that, and you have other districts that really do have more funding than they need from the state level. And have sustained
I completely, I'm fully aware of the impact of our current policy on school district of Lancaster and other districts in areas that are growing. Obviously, we're aware of that. But I also know that you just absolutely cannot sustain a hold harmless formula over an extended period of time as we have without really increasing the inequities among school districts. But my question to you is, would you support a phase-in that reduction of funding for an individual school district in the future over a period of just a few years? So it'd be very different from what we have now, where that's, we know we've got to address it one way or another, but it could be a compromise that would make that reduction in students more palatable for the school district that's experiencing that, and give them a little time to make the decisions they need to make.
Right. And I would say that I'm not opposed to that, but I'm a little leery of the details of that, of how long that phase will be, how much of it is kept. And
and I don't know the details.
Yeah.
It's a concept that I'm looking for a way to try to resolve it. But thank you.
Just one follow-up question in regards to the issue of adjustment, just so I'm clear in your position, probably the differential for Lancaster, similar to other districts, of the 2.5 to the 4 is because of probably the most, besides hold harmless, the most longstanding component of our formula, which is aid ratio and differentials in relative wealth. In a new formula, I would expect that would be a major point of consideration. Is that something that you would expect to be part of a new formula?
I would think that there would be, I would expect either through a very large weight on, for low-income students to address, high poverty areas, or I would think that, we've added it in place. I know there's been testimony that the current ratio, the MVPI, is flawed, but having some sort of adjustment for district wealth or district need and ability to pay at the local level.
Yeah, that's primarily what it's about. Is not about the additional expenditure that may not be necessary for a district to accommodate economically disadvantaged students, but the ability of that district to afford equity in terms of their ability to have enough resources to spend on behalf of those children. And I would expect that would continue to be a major point of consideration for this commission, and you would support that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your assistance today. Next on our agenda is the Pennsylvania School Boards Association. Thank you, gentlemen. Go ahead. If you could accommodate us, if you can keep your formal testimony to 15 to 20 minutes, we'd appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you.
Ready?
Before you start, I wanted to take an opportunity to recognize the Senate Democratic Education Chair, Senator Dennerman, who has joined us.
Thank you.
You may go, Winner.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Dr. Richard Ferricks, and I'm the elected president of the Pennsylvania School Board Association, a nonprofit student statewide association representing 4,500 elected school officials who govern the Commonwealth's public school districts. PSBA is a member-driven organization pledged to the highest ideals of local lay leadership for public schools and working to support reform for the betterment of public education. We promote the achievements of public schools and their elected local school boards. I'm joined by John Callahan, our Senior Director of Government Affairs. Today, we have the pleasure of representing the collective voice of the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials, and the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. These four organizations represent the leaders in public school policy and advocacy. Thank you for allowing us to speak with you today, to participate in the dialogue, and to continue working with you. The responsibility for control and support of public schools is legally vested in the General Assembly. But in large measure, the operation is delegated to local school boards who strive to improve the educational opportunities for children, youth, and adults, to use school tax dollars effectively, and to share the burdens of school support equitably. All of our associations believe that financial support from the Commonwealth to its local school district should be designated to assist in equalizing educational opportunities and in sustaining a steadily improving foundation of education. We are optimistic that the work of this foundation will finally help to develop and maintain a system of public school financing that emphasizes a sharing of costs between the Commonwealth and local school districts. State aid for school districts should be established through a funding formula that is equitable, adequate, comprehensive, and consistent. This morning we will focus on the answers to 4 questions. First, why is equitable investment in traditional public schools worthwhile? Secondly, what effect does the diversity of Pennsylvania have on public school funding? What pressures compete with funding, i.e., what is the expense side of public education? And finally, what you folks are waiting for, what formula do we believe establishes an equitable, adequate, comprehensive, and consistent funding mechanism? Our first question, what is an equitable investment in traditional public schools and why is it worthwhile? Public schools have a valuable place in our nation and in Pennsylvania. Public schools are mandated by federal and state law to meet the educational needs of all children. They do not discriminate or pick and choose which children are deserving of an education. The growth and contributions of public schools continue to show progress, and Pennsylvania schools are performing among the best in the country. Our public schools succeed in the face of economic and financial challenges, accountability pressures, and mandates to reduce achievement gaps and to raise student achievement. According to the 2014 Quality Accounts report from Education Week magazine, Pennsylvania ranks 8th in the nation in K-12 achievement. The report also graded Pennsylvania with a B in the Chance for Success category, noting that our state ranks above the national average for early foundations, school years, and adult concerns and outcomes. Consider these facts from the Pennsylvania Department of Education and other sources. Public schools and public school students are not failing. The results of the 2013-14 school performance profile show that 72% of public school buildings are performing well, with a score of 70 or higher. In 2014, Pennsylvania is only one of 10 states to earn an A in academic achievement, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. 68.7% of Pennsylvania students taking AP exams earn a score of 3 or above, which is above the national percentage of 58.7%. More than half, or 53%, of Pennsylvania's preschoolers, 3 and 4-year-olds, are served in state or federally funded early care and education programs. From 2008, 2009 to 2012-13, the number of industry certifications earned by career and technology education students has increased by over 75%. And Pennsylvania's adjusted cohort graduation rate is 84% for 2011-12, which is above the national average of 80%. Pennsylvania's dropout rate is declining. Pennsylvania's dropout rate for public school districts is 1.3% for the school year 2012-13, as compared to 1.87% in 2011-12. This includes the students in grades 7 to 12. Public schools and public school students are not failing, and an equitable investment in traditional public schools is certainly worthwhile. These successes show the importance of the state's investment in public education. These numbers are mostly state-based data points that do not show the differences between school districts on a more local level. We recognize that there are schools that are doing exceedingly well and others that are struggling. We believe we must provide the advisement and financial resources to those that are struggling, because it is imperative that they improve in order for their students to compete in a global society. Certainly, there's much work to be done, and an increase in state commitment to public schools will lead to increased achievement. Secondly, what effect does the diversity of Pennsylvania have on public school funding? What are the problems with the current funding system? PSBA, along with PASBO and PASA, have been around the state over the past several months, listening to local school district representatives speak about school funding concerns. Common themes that may possibly be addressed by changing the formula include enrollment. The current enrollment factor does not account for significant swings in enrollment due to unpredictable circumstances. 336 school districts have experienced a decrease, while 162 school districts have experienced an increase since 1993. Increased enrollment without adequate state resources and the implications of Act 1, placing constraints on the amount of local revenue, have led to overall decreasing of funding for certain districts. The budget process. School districts are currently in the process of working on their budget, and it will be finalized before a state budget is agreed upon in June. Because of the lack of a transparent and consistent formula, school districts cannot possibly predict with any certainty what funding they will have available in June of next year. Charter school funding. While the original intent to privatize public education and create laboratories for innovation was purposeful, the results of this experiment have been detrimental to student performance in many circumstances. The current formula that funds charter schools is bankrupting many districts because it is not fair or equitable and needs to be addressed. Tax exemptions. Large parcels of many districts' lands are exempt from taxation and leads to the inability to finance the public school system at the local level. Aid ratio issues. The ratio consists of two factors. These are combined to assess the relative wealth or poverty of a school district. Total market value of property amounts for 60%, while total personal income accounts for 40%. In some districts, the real property value could be high, for example, vacation, business, or lodging areas, while the district's constituents' personal income could be low. Shifting of public education expense. The proportion of state funding to local funding has been shifting, where now 58% is locally funded and only 35% is state funded. Property tax swings. In many areas of the state, businesses within a district have suffered, leading to large swings in local property tax receipts. The social repercussions of these changes take effect over a period of years and cause shortages over the short term for school districts. Now, these are just 7 areas that demonstrate the effect of diversity in Pennsylvania on public school funding. Now, what pressures compete with funding? What is the expense side of public education? Like any family budget discussion, we cannot speak about increased funding without addressing the cost side of the budget. The expense side of the budget in many cases is set by mandated costs that require school districts to do more without proportionally increased funding. For example, pension cost. Next year's rate will be the highest rate in PSER's history, 25.84%, a 442% increase since 2008. If this rate continues to rise, many of the school districts we have heard from over the past several months will be bankrupt in 2 to 3 years. Special education cost. While funding has remained relatively flat, the cost of special education has far outpaced inflation. Districts we spoke with experienced an average of an 8% increase over the past 5 years. Healthcare costs. Like any business in the state, school districts face a continual rise in the cost of healthcare that is outpacing inflation. Charter special education costs. On the average, based on the 2012-13 data from PDE, school districts spend approximately $13,000 per student on special education instructional costs. Under the charter school special education formula, charter schools are spending, on the average, $9,300 per student on special education instructional cost, despite the fact that they're receiving, on the average, $19,000 for every special education student. Charter school cost. The cost of charter schools has increased from $434 million in 2006-07 to $1.1 billion in 2011-12. The charter tuition calculation is weighted in favor of paying more for charter tuition than is included in the actual instructional expense at the traditional public schools. And the final pressure that I will mention are mandates. Mandates that require multiple state reports, as well as increased administrative cost and expenses that take away from instruction, mandates that affect maintenance and increase the cost of school buildings, and maintenance that prevent school districts from reducing staff size and operation costs when student enrollment decreases. I will now turn the microphone over to John Callahan, PSBA Senior Director of Government Affairs, who will answer the last question. What formula do we believe establishes an equitable, adequate, comprehensive, and consistent funding mechanism.
Thanks, Rich. The goal of any school funding formula, in our perspective, is to provide fair, predictable, adequate funding for all schools in Pennsylvania. I think that's what everybody here is looking for. The simple formula that the school leadership organizations, that's PSBA, PASBO, PASA, and PARS, came up with over the last few months as we were meeting, contains factors that addressed a multitude of local issues while not overburdening the formula with many factors. There was discussion about Florida. We were looking at that model. There were way too many factors within that formula. And I would actually say that within a simple formula, you get some of those multiple factors in larger factors like poverty weighting. You could look at that and it sucks in a few other Florida formula add-ons. So we believe the current aid ratio currently pollutes the formula as it is based on market value and personal income, both of which contain flaws that produce opposing results in many cases. We based our formula, and any new formula we would propose would only be applicable to new funding. So that's where we've come out on that end. The factors that we would like the Commission to consider are very simple. And I think you've heard it from my colleague Jay last time he was here, Jay Himes. So we're pretty much in agreement with that. Average adjusted daily membership. We believe that you have to start off the formula with counting students. And the way you can do that is by actually averaging it out over 5 years, weighting the most recent year more than the fifth year out. This way you avoid the swings that would come with some, maybe you have a detrimental situation within a district that you lose quite a bit of students. You at least are able to smooth out those major swings. So that's why we request an average on counting students. Student weights. We would look at very simple student weights that I think bring in some larger issues. That's poverty based on Census Bureau factors. That's a pure poverty issue, and it's census based. And I would also say on the census side and the factors that we put in here, they are all known factors. They're factors that you can find that are transparent. We really stuck to hopefully transparent factors that you could find and are readily available and people can rely on. English language learners, that's in the PIM systems. That's a very reliable factor that we're all kind of used to. We also look at district weights. Sparsity size adjustments. This is actually my compliments to the Special Ed Commission, because you came up with sparsity size adjustments and it really worked. Those numbers work for the Special Ed formula, and I think they'll work in this case dealing with districts like Forest School District, dealing with how large those districts are and trying to factor in how much those actual large districts cost. There are two last factors that were probably the most difficult, but we believe are very important. Local tax effort. These were very challenging figures. When you don't want to use aid ratio because you see some anomalies in that issue, how do you get to a local tax effort? We came up with, in essence, a household payment average divided by the median household income. And by coming to that number, we were able to calculate and see that it would apply to those areas that have already taxed their districts to the end, and it would actually help those districts, and then those districts that potentially have more taxing power, taxing ability, it would actually give them less. So those numbers worked out very well when we did that calculation, but we're open to other ones as well. That is a very difficult number to get to. Local cost adjustments. We also realize you have to kind of have a cost of living in this factor. And there's several different ways of doing that, and I would encourage, what we encourage actually is looking at the Independent Fiscal Office and giving them a set formula that they would do on a yearly basis. Several states do this, and the ones we would kind of direct you to have three different models: Maryland, Alaska, and Texas. And they take different cost of living factors, including salaries and just kind of the Bureau of Labor Statistics factors, and put them together in a model that is consistent, transparent. And they actually have, in some cases, they have their Independent Fiscal Office do it, or they have a company or somebody that they hire to just do the math behind these factors and put together the weighting for this factor. So local cost adjustment again, is a difficult one to get to. And we really struggled with local tax effort and local cost adjustment. But we believe that these were two good ideas and two good ways to point the commission, at least in these directions, to target these very important areas of what we would consider a good, simple formula. And again, I stress simple because it's based on, in almost all the cases here, data that's readily available, that we know is reliable, and a limited amount of factors and factors in it that can't be really played around with at the end of the day. When I look at Florida, I look at the potential for factors to be played around with at the end of the day. And we would like to have a very consistent, transparent formula that school districts know from year to year, this is how it's going to be and it's not going to change. So that would conclude our testimony. We really, truly appreciate the time and effort today, and we are very optimistic about the work of this commission and excited.
Thank you, gentlemen. Questions or comments from members? Co-Chairman Burr.
Jonathan, since you're at the mic, let's start back with your weights. Did we look at anything beyond poverty? Did we look at children that are high-performing children? And I know we talk about, some people want to talk about wealth and taxability, but what about where there isn't wealth and there isn't the taxability that we keep talking about? What about our higher-performing students?
Yep. We did talk about that, but we talked to some of the larger, greater costs of a school district, which would be typically those students that are in extreme poverty or just plain, and I hate to say two different factors. It's kind of like extreme poverty, 100% of the poverty factor, and poverty factor is in accepting food stamps and so forth on 185%. So we looked at those ends, said that typically those children come with a greater expense. So admit we approached the greater expense side, but very willing to look at it's still an expense for advanced learners as well, to look at that factor. But we took the biggest one that we look at budgets, and you can see clearly on a school budget, these kids cost significantly more than advanced learners.
Does the PSBA have a proposal, or any of the groups that you're here representing today, do they have any proposals on pension reform?
Yeah, yes, we do have two.
I'd love to see them.
We will get them to you. That's our pleasure.
Okay, and just a comment, I don't think 70% grade average is a good performing school. And I understand overall maybe the system is doing well, but that's completely unacceptable. If we're talking mid-80s and 90s, and that's obviously a well-oiled machine, but when we have kids at 70%, they're percentage points away from not being well-performing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dinnerman.
You have the ADM as your most crucial factor. But the truth of the matter is, many of our school districts don't really know their numbers. You yourself, in your truancy and other reporting, essentially accept that. The very districts that are hurting the most because of poverty or ESL are the very districts that get undercounted. Why does one get undercounted? For example, we know that in districts, the students who might be there in the beginning of the year might not be there in the middle of the year or other times during the year. We know that some of our poorer districts are not fully cognizant of even who's there and who comes and who leaves. So, what is your process to make sure? I mean, if you're doing a 5-year average, well, that's nice. But for the poorer districts, which are, and with all due respect to Ms. Perez, when I've tried to ask the department for precise figures in terms of truancy and other questions, and they're as mystified as we are. Okay? So what's your solution to that, John?
Yeah, I mean, Senator, counting students, it sounds so simple.
It is not.
But it is not at all simple, and we know that. It's a partnership between the school district and the Department of Education to get it right. You have to, and what we would encourage is doing an average of the year and then doing an average, weighted average over the 5 years. not only would you hopefully smooth out the year factors, but also over the term of 5 years to be able to smooth out some large swings as well. It is not simple, and getting to that, how do you get down to the process of counting kids? I probably could spend another 30 or 40 minutes on it, but I think it is truly a partnership and has to be a trusted partnership between the Department of Ed and each school district. We can put that kind of thing in law and take the regulations that are on that and put them in law, but I would say it's better to kind of put the averages and then start working out each instance. It's very difficult. I can't say, and it works different for each school district almost.
It is difficult, you are correct. And once a year, is it not in October where a school district reports what it has? But again, until on the matter of poverty and ESL students, the very individuals who we're talking about having weighted factors, they tend to be undercounted, and they tend to move. In part because of poverty, because of the cost of housing. And so I would hope PSBA and the commission itself would make some effort to really try to understand this matter of attendance, which we haven't done enough work in yet in this Commonwealth.
Yeah, and I'll make a further comment. I mean, we were around the state and talked to a lot of our school districts, and it was definitely an issue that you have kind of this transient / population that goes in and out of the schools, and sometimes your level of population stays steady, but you have 30% of your school district move changing during a year, but it's still at X level, or sometimes it goes down. Getting those kids counted and trying to figure out the additional cost, especially for, I'll call them transient students, is going to be very tough. So we had a difficult time and struggled with it. I'm not opposed to kind of putting that in a factor at the end of the day, but it's going to involve a lot more thinking than we did over the past 3 months, I imagine.
Well, those are your most vulnerable students.
Agreed.
And if you're really serious about funding schools to assist those that are most vulnerable, then this is one of the factors that has to be looked at by all of us and has to be included in our efforts to get a real ADM figure that's fair and that helps the school districts who are most in trouble right now. I mean, I'm thinking of Mr. Chairman, I'm thinking of testimony that the Allentown superintendent gave us in that regard in terms of numbers. And so this is, I'm not taking away from what you're saying, and 5 years is better than 1 year, but it's something we need to evolve and figure out how to do if we're going to help the more vulnerable students and the districts that are most in need.
Senator Dinnerman is correct in regards to his conversation on transiency. I know I can reflect, and there's some of us who can, on that issue. I have elementary schools in the school district of Allentown where 70% of the children who are enrolled in September are not there in June. And that is a serious issue in regards to not only student count, but just the provisions of education for those children. So that's something that has taken a significant amount of time with this commission in deciding how to accommodate that. Hawaii had it accommodated through an individual student weight, which you would have to define what a transient student is. And I'm curious to see how Hawaii did that. Another way to do it would be through a district adjustment, because I would think in many districts it's something they have to accommodate across the entire district, and if you can properly define it and determine what a district would need to spend to accommodate it, then you can adjust accordingly with the weight. And I would expect that the PSBA is looking at that in more aggregate terms when it comes to adjusting for poverty.
Yes, and that's really, thank you, Senator, that's really where we looked at it and said, well, we don't know exactly how to get at that number yet, but we can look at poverty as one of the ways to, I guess you could say, supplement that issue. And then secondly, also ELL as well as another way we would be able to supplement that issue.
And the issue of poverty, we have had multiple conversations in the commission regarding what data set you would use for that. Free and reduced lunch the new determination of economically disadvantaged students. Do you have any recommendations as to what data set we should
We look straight at census, poverty factors, and really it's a factor that we could rely on. It's something that everybody understands is consistent. Now, of course, there's different levels of how you can get to that. What do you look at? 185% of the poverty factor? Do you look at? We even spoke about 2 different levels of that. Do you give, for those that are in severe poverty, as I said before, 100%? That's pretty severe. You give it extra weighting for that. So there's different methods, but we would look at keeping the data point very consistent and something that people understand, and we believe that the census data was very accurate at that point.
I appreciate your hard work in collaboration with the Pennsylvania school business officials on suggesting an alternative to the most longstanding component of our formula, and that's aid ratio. The component that is in the formula to try to achieve equity as an alternative to what's already being used. Can you comment on the efficacy or the justification in that proposal of not having commercial property as part of the analysis?
Well, I guess when we were looking at local tax effort and going after that, I guess you could say policy point, everybody agreed that we need to account for that, but aid ratio isn't doing it. How do we get to it? And not putting the kind of business properties in there, actually it just kind of happened organically. We did it without it, and the numbers seemed to work, to be honest about it. So when we saw that the numbers worked, in essence we stopped there, that these numbers made sense. They made sense for the school districts, and they made sense for the policy. So that's just the simple answer to it. I hate to say you might be looking for something more complicated, but the numbers seem to work.
If in the end we want something that works. So if that's the case, in regards to what works, have you looked at that proposal and its relations to the districts in Monroe County?
I don't recall. I apologize.
Suggest that you take a look at that, because there is. In regards to that way of determining, they are districts that they stick out, I guess.
Okay.
And maybe in the right way, but it's important that you take a look at that, because the districts in Monroe sit in a place in that analysis that is obviously different than most districts, and that's the way probably it should work, but if there's anything in that needs to be considered, we need to consider that.
We saw that it kind of modified some of the Pocono region issues. It modified the Forest County issues, the large farming areas, and those are some of the problems that we had with aid ratio, frankly. So that was kind of our initial reaction, saying, okay, we're close here. It's not perfect potentially, and I think it's still a work in progress, but we're getting closer. How's that?
Work in progress that's exactly where we need to be at this point. And just one last comment in regards to what aid ratio does, and to see if what your proposal accommodates this. You had commented in your testimony, the aid ratio also does not function because it has a floor that for some lower aid ratio districts provides funding that would not be realized if it was set at an actual number.
Correct.
A lot of southeast districts like that. Does your proposal accommodate that?
Our proposal does accommodate that. I mean, you could always set a floor in it, but you kind of create different anomalies. I mean, let's be frank.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator Smucker.
Thank you for being here. I'd like to just test your thoughts on the idea of whatever we do applying only to new dollars. Can you tell us just a little bit more about your thinking on that?
We looked at, this kind of gets to the hold harmless issue. It seems to be the elephant in the room. But it's definitely something we have to deal with. At the end of the day, when you look at the hold harmless and you're just going to, and you've already kind of had this discussion, you flick that switch off, let's just say you do it today. Tomorrow, we'd have lots of school districts and not able to function and bankrupt. So we can't, from an association standpoint, we can't do that to school districts just overnight. Now, when we're looking, you were talking about a phase-in or something of that sort, or phase-out, I guess you could say, of hold harmless. We have had those discussions among our members. We haven't had a full conclusion on that and how that's going to work, but we're still discussing that. What we did discuss with our membership was, let's let's just base it on new dollars. Let's just go forward from here. Still have the hold harmless discussion, obviously, but for the purposes of establishing a formula that's transparent, that we can actually build off of and have a good, strong foundation, this is why we came to this conclusion.
Yeah, and I think maybe I'm getting just a little ahead of where we need to go here, where I think we need to go, and that is we should establish what we think is a fair formula. Sort of if we're starting with creating a new formula today, what would it look like? And I think that's been a lot of the discussion. But then the next question will be, how do we get to that over a period of time? And you know, I would suggest, I haven't looked at the numbers, and I don't know if you have at all, but I don't think you can get there anytime soon by applying it only to new dollars. So I think at some point along the way, you know, some school districts will need to make decisions that over a period of time may impact current level of funding. I don't know whether that's true or not, but you know, I don't see down the road, maybe you think so, but I don't think looking at, you know, the rising costs of pensions, for instance, and looking at the available state dollars, looking at next year's budget and budgets beyond that, that you're going to see a huge infusion of dollars in education funding. You'll see some, I think, and over time that you know, we don't know. But I don't think there's enough to get to a fair formula within decades. Those are numbers we ought to run soon. But you know, I'm surprised to hear you say that whatever formula we do should only apply to new dollars. I think that's going to be a very, very small component of the total dollars, and there are districts that really need help today.
Yeah, we truly recognize it's a long. I mean, that's a long phase in, phase out, whatever you want to call it, program. But you know, what we were also more concerned with, I guess, paramountly, is the fact that so you're looking at hold harmless, simply flicking off that switch causes so many districts to kind of go out of business overnight. And that would be detrimental.
I'm not talking,
I think we're all right.
I'm not talking flicking off the switch.
You're talking about a phase
at a given point in time. I'm saying establishing a schedule over 10 years of getting to the new formula that we may all agree is a fair and equitable formula, rather than saying it's only going to be new dollars. And we'd have to run numbers. I don't know that anyone's done that yet, but you know, I guess I'm just suggesting you hold open that possibility that this is an important enough issue that we may need to go beyond just new dollars.
And Senator, let me just say, from PSBA's standpoint, we've held open that option. We're still talking it over with our members. I think that's a huge decision at the end of the day for all our members.
Yeah, and I think you'll be your organization representing all of the school districts across the state will be a really, really important part of how, you know, we all agree that should be approached.
I have 4,500 bosses, so we have to go to every one of them.
Yeah. Thank you.
As Chris Wheatley for Chairman Roebuck.
Yes, John, just one clarification on the local tax effort. When you talk about the total property tax divided by the total assessed value, are you only talking the tax on the residential and dividing that by the residential?
We had taken residential.
So you're not taking all the property tax and just dividing it by, so it's you're doing residential to residential?
Correct.
Okay, so that at least creates some apples to apples. We want to make sure of that. Second, you add this local cost adjustment, obviously for things. I'm assuming that's things like special ed and pensions and healthcare, all the things you've enumerated today would be part of that. First question, have you seen any costs on that in terms of percentages, particularly compared to what we use right now for Act 1 in terms of its inflation index?
Yeah, we looked particularly just kind of at the concept as a whole. We didn't run numbers on this. This was one of the hardest concepts to get at, realizing that you could take the Bureau's labor statistics and take their cost their cost of living, but it only applies to regions. It wouldn't be able to be applicable down to the granular level. So how do you get down to that level? And in essence, it kind of left us with this conundrum saying, well, how do other states do it? And that's when we started looking at Maryland and Alaska, Texas, and there are others that do it. And they each have different factors, including the Bureau of Labor statistic info, but also looking at how much teacher salaries are there, how much does it cost for, even down to how much does it cost for property in that area versus property in another area. And like I said, there are several different ways of doing it, and I don't think any of them are wrong. They all kind of come, I think, to the right conclusion at the end of the day and getting at cost of living adjustments. But it is definitely something you would want to, I think, assign to a numbers group like Independent Fiscal Office or something of that sort to do on a yearly basis to make sure that that number is accurate and correct.
And would that adjustment be something where we would run the formula and then we would add this adjustment, kind of like a COLA?
We went back and forth on those two issues because,
Right.
again,
Or is it part of the formula?
as everybody knows, how you run these numbers and the sequence that you run them
Right.
is very can vary the formula greatly. In this case, we put it as kind of like the last weighted measurement. You could weight things, so we put it in the formula itself. But it could be on the outside as little turn on the thing.
Right.
But we put it in the formula in this
But
proposal.
you put it in the formula? so-
Yes.
Okay. So it would have,
A weight.
in comparison to other things that are weighted, it would have some.
It would have a
effect.
weight assigned to it,
Relative
correctly.
effect. All right.
Yes, thank you. Senator Dinniman.
Does PSBA represent Philadelphia?
We do now.
So then, what we would say then is in this understanding that you have before us, it doesn't represent, potentially doesn't represent the thoughts or the needs of the largest district within the Commonwealth. I mean, I only ask that, and I realize you didn't, by the way, is simply because as we go about our work, Philadelphia, the largest school district, might have some exceptional needs or might have to be approached in a different way than other 499 districts. And so did PSBA, in coming up with this, if it doesn't represent Philadelphia, did you have conversations with SRC and with Dr. Haidt and others in Philadelphia to come up with your plan?
We had discussions with a representative body of the organization that includes Philadelphia region as a whole. But we have a challenge as an organization that we have to represent all those diverse needs, and so does this commission. So we tried our best to kind of put in factors that would account for Philadelphia's needs, like the poverty, like the ELL stuff, but keep it simple and not something that had other formula components that could be not reliable or adjustable. So when we were considering other components, the problem was those data components oftentimes were not things that were reliable or consistent across the state. So we did try our best to include the Philadelphia and Allentown and York and Lancaster and Allegheny counties, but it is, as you already know, a daunting task to come up with something that applies to the entire state as a whole.
I only make these comments, John, so as we go about our work, we know that perhaps some of the needs in the Philadelphia district are of a dimension that's larger because of size, or recent research has doing nothing to do with this, but it's dealing with these required testing. So I was interested in biology, for example. In one high school I went into, there is no biology teacher there, by the way. They haven't had labs in 4 years, and they're using textbooks that are dated 2003. So in terms of tests, those kids have no chance at all. But what I'm saying is that there are some unique factors that this commission has to understand when it comes up with these, with our figures. And I was just using that, you're not representing Philadelphia simply to indicate that. And I'm sure you would agree with me as well.
Senator, I always agree with whatever you say.
I know that, John. And that's why we get along so well.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chairman Burr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we move on to our next panel, just if you could kindly, and I don't want to get into it here, I looked for it and in transition do not have it, but a position paper where PSBA stands on school tax elimination, the different bill numbers that we've heard about. I certainly favor it. It's not a discussion for this panel per se, but if you can get me where you feel, because obviously we have to pay bills, and a position paper on that, and if in fact they are opposed to it, what is the solution to the property tax burden of our local share?
We can get you that. It's actually on our website. We'll get it to you.
Okay.
But in essence, we look for multiple different ways of taxation. So kind of
Okay.
giving different options. And there's several different bills out there that kind of accomplish that. But it all kind of boils down to, do the numbers work at the end of the day, which is probably the most important part
Right.
of it. So if you give more options, it's a matter of actually having the numbers work for school districts.
Whatever your position is, and then whatever ideas you have, you could just get them to me, and I
Will do.
appreciate it. Or if others want it as well, I couldn't find it, but thank you.
We'll get it.
We'll do that.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Unusually, we are actually running 15 minutes ahead. So with the permission of the commission members, I would like to call for a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back.
I know.